a two-time nominee for Outstanding Professor at San Jose State University, has written a new book that's promising to be right on time for the 2016 presidential election. We're talking about Dr. Richard Craig and your new book. This is part of your academic history and research.
Yeah, actually, the whole project began when I was in grad school, and I had noticed in watching television coverage of presidential campaigns that you would have things that we sort of took for granted that don't strike me as terribly natural. You would have reporters covering a campaign basically saying, well, this candidate is ahead in the polls, therefore this is what he should be doing, and this candidate is behind in the polls, and this is what they should be doing. And that just struck me as we take it for granted, but why is that so? Why should campaigning be driven by polls? And that was what started the whole project. What it became was a look at all the presidential campaigns from 1968 to 2012 and looked at the impact of polls on reporting and the idea of expectation setting, where basically expectation setting is a reporter saying, because of the fact they are ahead in the polls or behind in the polls, this is what a candidate should be doing. And that just strikes me as something that we shouldn't necessarily accept at face value. And I measured that throughout this period, and in 1968 it was practically unknown. By the 90s it was completely commonplace, and these days we, again, just sort of take it for granted.
Well, you make the point in the book that it's now, since the 1990s, all of the media seems to be just driven by polls and not as much substance of reporting.
Yeah.
So was that part of the point of doing this book?
Yeah, part of it was that. The thing that I would acknowledge, I mean, I was a reporter for a number of years, and I know that if you are covering something day by day, you need to have material. And the campaigns got so good at releasing material, you know, in perfect little dribs and drabs that reporters were looking for something to say. And because primaries have become sort of the engine that drives presidential nominations, they got into the idea, well, who's ahead and who's behind in the polls, and at least it gave them something to talk about every day. And what that did was it gave primacy to polls in primaries and eventually throughout the whole general election, to where, because you have to have something to say every day, polls are sort of an easy way to approach it. There's something people can grab a hold of.
It just doesn't give you the complete picture.
Right.
The
the problem is that polls are basically a popularity contest. They're not at all about the substance of a candidate. Has nothing necessarily to do with issues, has nothing to do with plans for the nation. It's all just what is widely referred to as the horse race, who is ahead and who's behind. And there is some reporting of issues along the way. It's not completely devoid of that, but it's certainly not the main focus. It's a secondary matter. It's basically using what's going on in the campaign trail, using issues to explain why you're ahead or behind, as opposed to, you know, is this a good or a bad idea?
And many of us are fascinated by presidential campaigns, the nuances, not only the mistakes the candidates make, but also their backgrounds and things they've done in their political record and such. But you and I talked about the 1980 presidential election, and I was working as a TV reporter covering returns on television in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But I remember very distinctly our advisor on polling told us mid-afternoon that the exit polls were clearly stating Ronald Reagan was going to win the presidency. And we weren't supposed to talk about it. But by 8 o'clock that night, it was being reported Eastern time, and they were still voting here in the West.
That's right. Yeah, the thing that's interesting, people forget that this was considered to be a pretty close race right up until Election Day. It was a surprise that Reagan won by as much as he did. But what ended up happening, there was a lot of belief, at least, that because the networks were calling the race at 5 p.m. Pacific time, because Jimmy Carter conceded the race before the polls were closed out here in California, it might very well have had an impact on a number of local, regional, even statewide races. A governor's race was considered to have been affected by that.
Very much so. And now, fast forward to 2016, we have a lot of people in our society, students as well as people in our community, who hate politics, don't want to deal with politics. Why should I mess with those nonsense people? What would you say in terms of what your book is trying to teach us?
Well, there's a lot of reasons to jump to that conclusion, because all you ever hear about is sort of the extreme statements, poll data. It seems like there's nobody to vote for. I mean, there's the old saw, if God had meant us to vote, he would have given us candidates. But basically, what you need to get at is the fact that this could have serious impact on you. There is information out there that can educate you about what's going on and about where the real substance may lie. The difficulty is finding it because, in the information age, it would stand to reason that you would have all this information available. You could make a very informed choice. We almost have too much. It's, finding this island of real content in this ocean of, personality-driven information. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is to kind of say, what's going on here? What's the structure that has been adopted, and is it really good for America? Is it really good for the political process?
Well, certainly after the Trump phenomenon of 2016, I think a lot of people at the end of this year are going to stand back and say, now wait a minute, are we happy with our system being driven so much by polls and social media, tweets here and tweets there, when we're not really hearing what we need to meet the needs of our country?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge for the news media to step back and say, look, at the moment as we speak, the primaries are still going on. There's a lot of candidates out there. We need to sort of be in charge of saying, look, here's what's going on. Here's where these people stand. We talk about fact checking, but it's gotten to the point where a candidate makes a statement, and one side says he's lying because of this. The other side says they're lying because of this.
Who do you believe?
It's very difficult to sort of find an impartial, look at these things. So what you need to do is become a discerning information consumer. You need to say, okay, here's what I see. Now, what's really going on here? And dig a little bit on your own. A lot of people aren't that interested in it, or they're certainly not interested early in the game.
Well, we like horse races. We like to see who's ahead, who's behind. But ultimately, in a few years, it's going to come down to how much taxes we're paying and what kind of rules and policies are going to directly affect our lives. Final thought would be, you and I like quotes. I remember telling you that growing up in Illinois, Abraham Lincoln had a quote attributed to him: before you shoot off your mouth, make sure your brains are loaded.
Yes.
What would be yours in tying into your book?
Well, all I would say is you need to consider a lot of things. You can't just rely on polls. You can't just rely on who's hot and who's not. You can't rely on what's trending. If you care about the success of our democracy, at whatever level, your local level all the way up to President of the United States, it's sort of incumbent upon you to do a little homework, to look beyond all of this. I would say it's incumbent upon the news media to clarify. Rather than just falling back on what is easy to do every day, you need to clarify things. You need to say, here is what's going on, here's what it really means. And yes, you're going to get charges back and forth about bias this way, bias that way, but you can't at some level worry about that. You just have to do your job well. There's examples in the book of where, the media have done their job well. I tried to be as fair as I could in here, but
we can always do better.
Yeah, you don't want to reflexively fall back on easy coverage, because that's not going to help the process. It's not going to help democracy.
That's why I'm glad you're in charge of the Spartan Daily. You tell that to your students, and that's something that journalists must always remember.
Yeah.
Dr. Richie Craig, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.